My name is Leslie, and if someone looked at my life from the outside, they would say it is flawless. I have been married to Mark for 10 years, and one might say we are the perfect couple. We have two wonderful children and a cozy home on the outskirts of the city where every morning begins with smiles and sunlight. On Sundays, we often have picnics, gather all our friends, and enjoy warm company and tranquility, and every detail of our existence seems perfectly planned. Every morning, Mark wakes me up with a gentle kiss. It's his tradition. He always wakes up first, prepares breakfast, and calls the kids. In these little things, I feel his care and love. We discuss our plans for the day, laugh at the kids' antics, and it seems that this routine has become part of our very essence. I often thought that we were among those lucky people. We knew what we wanted in life, and we had it. One day, upon waking up in the morning, when Mark kissed me as usual, I suddenly felt something strange. "Leslie, how about we go somewhere for the weekend?" Mark asked one day while we were having breakfast together. He looked at me with that spark in his eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. "Let's just change our surroundings and spend some time as a family." I lifted my eyes from my cup of coffee and smiled. The suggestion was unexpected but pleasant. We rarely went out just the two of us, or even with the kids, always absorbed in our daily routines. "Are you serious? What about your work?" I asked, teasing him slightly. He was one of those people who were always busy, and the idea of a weekend without emails and calls seemed almost fantastical. "Well, this time I'm ready to take a break," he smirked, reaching for another cup of coffee. "I was thinking we could rent a cottage by the lake. Remember how you used to love nature?" "I did love it," I quietly repeated, realizing that I hadn't thought about such things in a long time. "All right, let's give it a try." And so it happened. A few days later, we headed to a nearby town and rented a small cottage right on the lake shore. That day, everything seemed absolutely perfect. The children were laughing, running on the grass, and playing with a ball. Mark was fussing with the boat, preparing it for a water ride, while I stood on the porch, feeling the fresh breeze and, for the first time in a long while, truly feeling calm. "Mom, can Dad and I go boating?" My eldest son shouted, interrupting my thoughts. "Of course," I smiled. "Just be careful, okay?" Mark approached me, gesturing invitingly with his hand, offering me to join them. "Leslie, come with us. You'll like it," he said, grinning broadly. I nodded and followed them to the water. We spent the entire day at the lake, laughing, sharing stories, and enjoying every moment. The children looked happy, Mark was relaxed, and it was such a rare moment to see him without the constant worries about work. In the evening, after the children were sound asleep, Mark and I sat by the campfire. The air was filled with the scent of smoke and damp grass, and night had already settled over the lake. I looked at him and suddenly asked, "Do you think we're still the same as we used to be?" He looked at me, somewhat surprised, and fell silent for a few seconds. "In what sense?" he asked, slightly frowning his brows. "I don't know. Sometimes it feels like our life has become too monotonous. We used to be different, Mark. We dreamed so much, made plans, but now everything has become so routine, predictable." Mark nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that too. Work, the kids, it consumes everything. But Les, that doesn't mean something is wrong. We've just grown up. Our lives have changed." We fell silent, watching the quietly burning fire. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, Mark walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table with his laptop. "How's work?" I asked, trying to spark a conversation. "A lot of tasks. I'll be finishing up a bit later today. I need to send a couple of reports," he replied, not taking his eyes off the screen. Dinner conversations were similarly strained. We only discussed everyday trivialities. "Mom, can we go to the park after school tomorrow?" my younger child asked, breaking the silence. Of course, I responded with a smile, happy to see some liveliness at the table. Mark glanced at me briefly, then returned to his phone and added, I probably won't make it. I have a meeting with clients. One more week passed. Everything remained as monotonous and predictable as before. One evening, while tidying up the old closet, I came across a box where I kept my old belongings. Opening it, I was immersed in memories. Inside were photographs from our first dates with Mark, letters from friends, and something unexpected, my old diary. I took it in my hands and sat on the bed. The pages had yellowed, but the memories they held were vivid, as if it were yesterday. I began to read, and my thoughts transported me back to those days when I was younger, full of energy and dreams. In the pages of this diary, I had recorded my boldest desires. There were plans for travels, ambitions to become a writer, dreams of opening my own bookstore. I flipped through a few pages and suddenly realized how far I had strayed from the girl who was once full of life and ideas. In my youth, I wanted to explore the world, to learn, to create. And now? Now my life was reduced to routine, endless household chores, and conversations about work. Mark entered the bedroom, seeing me with the diary in my hands. What do you have there? He asked with a slight smile. It's my old diary, I replied, still lost in the past. I kept it when I was younger. I'm reading it and amazed at how much I wanted to do. That was a long time ago, Les. Life changes and we change with it, he said, sitting down beside me. Yes, but sometimes I feel like I've forgotten who I really am, I admitted, closing the diary. I dreamed of writing, traveling, and now, I don't know. Mark looked at me thoughtfully. But you can still do those things, he said, offering a gentle encouragement. Why not get back to writing? You always talked about it. I smiled. His words were unexpected, but so simple. Maybe I really should give it a try. That night, I lay in bed, reflecting on how long it had been since I engaged in something that was truly mine. The next day, I found several of my old stories and decided to start writing again. In the evenings, after the children had fallen asleep, I sat down at the computer and allowed my thoughts to flow freely. A couple of weeks later, I even sent a few stories to local magazines. Mark was happy for me, supportive, and it filled me with new energy. But despite this, an emptiness still lingered inside. Yes, I had started doing something new, but the feeling that something was missing never went away. One evening, after the children were already asleep and Mark was once again engrossed in work, I decided to visit a writer's forum I had recently found. There, people discussed books, shared ideas, and offered each other writing advice. I thought it would be a good way to connect with people who share my interests and perhaps find some inspiration. As I browsed through the topics, I noticed a comment from a member named Alex. He provided insightful advice, recommended books I was familiar with, and his thoughts seemed deeper than the others. I decided to respond to his comment, and soon our interaction turned into private correspondence. Your ideas about the novel as a form of exploring the human soul truly impressed me, I wrote to him. It seems you understand literature on a deeper level. A few minutes later, he replied, Thank you. It's probably my passion. Have you been writing for a long time? I sat for a long time, unsure how to respond. Everything felt so easy when communicating with this person. I didn't feel any pressure or the need to pretend to be someone else. I wrote in my youth, I admitted. I'm now trying to get back to it after a long break, but sometimes it feels like I've lost the passion I once had. Alex responded quickly, Sometimes we just need to find a new perspective. Maybe you haven't found your true voice yet? This struck a chord with me. We continued exchanging messages, discussing our favorite books, styles, and themes that interested us. Alex turned out to be someone I could talk to for hours. He was passionate about philosophy, history, and shared such profound thoughts that my own ideas seemed to come alive. It was easy and engaging. I felt that for the first time in a long while, I was finding a conversational partner who understood me on a different level. One evening, already late, I noticed that time had flown by unnoticed. Mark was sitting next to the laptop, but he didn't seem to notice that I was engrossed in my correspondence with Alex. "How's work going?" I asked, breaking the silence. "Same as usual. A bit stressful, but I'm managing," Mark replied shortly, not taking his eyes off the screen. I nodded and switched back to the chat window with Alex. "Do you write when others are asleep?" Alex asked in the next message. "Sometimes. It's the only time I can focus," I replied, smiling. I realized that our communications seemed innocent. We were only talking about books and our hobbies, but inside me was a growing feeling that it was something more than just exchanging thoughts about literature. Several weeks passed, and my correspondence with Alex continued to develop. Every message from him felt like a breath of fresh air. We discussed books, shared opinions about writing, and I felt that I had found someone who understood me like no one else. It was an innocent hobby, I told myself. Mark was still immersed in work, and I saw nothing dangerous in it. One evening, while lying in bed with my phone in hand, I received a new message from Alex. "Leslie, how would you feel about meeting in person? There will be a book exhibition in your city at the end of the month. It would be great to meet and discuss literature face to face." I froze for a few seconds, staring at his message. A meeting? This proposal caught me off guard. I thought long and hard about whether to agree. Mark was leaving for a conference that weekend, and I could carve out the time. But a part of me didn't want to. It seemed that crossing boundaries would be inappropriate. Nevertheless, curiosity got the better of me. I convinced myself that it was merely a meeting between two people passionate about literature. Nothing more. The next day, I wrote to Alex. "Sounds interesting. I think I can make it." When the day of the exhibition arrived, I was nervous. Mark had flown off to the conference, and I, leaving the children with their grandparents, headed to the meeting. Alex suggested we meet at a cafe near the exhibition, and upon entering, I immediately recognized him from the photo he had once sent. "Leslie?" he said, smiling as I approached. "Hi, Alex," I replied, feeling a slight tension. There was something in his eyes that made me a bit nervous, though outwardly he looked friendly and relaxed. We ordered coffee and began talking about literature, as expected. The first half hour went just like our correspondence, discussing favorite authors, sharing stories about our creative processes. But at some point, I noticed his attention began to shift. He was looking at me more not as a fellow literature enthusiast, but as a woman. "You're always so passionate when you talk about books," he said, leaning in slightly closer. "It's very attractive." This phrase caught me off guard. I suddenly felt uncomfortable. Something inside me flipped. It was no longer just an ordinary conversation about literature. I glanced at my watch, subtly indicating that it was time to leave. "You know, I need to go," I said, standing up. "It was nice meeting you, Alex, but I think it's best we don't prolong this." He looked at me with a slight smile, but disappointment flickered in his eyes. "Of course, Leslie. It was nice to meet you." I said my goodbyes and hurried to the exit, feeling my heart beat faster than usual. Stepping out of the cafe, I felt a tremendous sense of relief for not allowing the situation to go further. Returning home after meeting Alex, I felt a strange sense of relief. The next day, when Mark returned from the conference, I felt that I needed to tell him everything. Not about what happened with Alex, nothing significant had occurred, but about what was troubling me. Our relationship was no longer the same as it once was, and I couldn't ignore it. But how to start this conversation? Everything seemed so fragile. We were sitting in the kitchen having dinner. The children had already gone to their rooms, and the house was enveloped in a pleasant silence. I mustered up the courage. "Mark, can I ask you a question?" I began, trying to stay calm. He looked up from his plate and glanced at me with slight surprise. "Of course, Les. Something happened?" he asked, putting down his fork. I gathered all my strength and exhaled. "Do you feel that something has changed between us? That we've grown apart?" Mark frowned, and I saw a seriousness appear on his face. "What do you mean?" he asked cautiously. "I don't know. Lately, I feel like we hardly talk. Everything boils down to work, the kids, household matters. We've lost something important. I just don't want this to pass us by." My words came out slowly, but I was finally voicing what had been building inside me for a long time. "Les, I understand that I've been consumed by work lately," he finally said. "I've really felt that something has changed, but I didn't know how to talk about it. I think I've just drifted away. From everything. From you, from myself. I didn't want to hurt you." He paused, then continued. "We've been together for so long, and maybe it's normal to feel some distance at times, but I don't want to lose what we have. You're important to me, Les, and I want to get it back." His words pierced me. It was what I had longed to hear, but didn't know how to prompt such a conversation between us. I sighed with relief, feeling the walls that had stood between us beginning to crumble. "I want that too, Mark," I whispered. "It feels like we've sunk so deep into our routine that we've forgotten what it's like to truly be together." Several weeks had passed since the evening when Mark and I finally had an honest conversation. Our relationship began to gradually recover. We started spending more time together, going on family trips, returning to our old traditions, and even began laughing again as we did in the early days of our marriage. I felt that the connection between us, which we had almost lost, was reappearing. But one evening, something happened that made me doubt again. Mark left his phone on the living room table and went to his study. I wasn't planning to touch it, but when it suddenly rang and the name Kelly appeared on the screen, something clicked inside me. I grabbed the phone before I could think. It was a regular text message. "Hi. How was the meeting? Hope your report impressed." Nothing suspicious at first glance, but my intuition suggested that there was something more between them than just work. I knew that Mark communicated with his work colleagues and had female acquaintances, but I had never seen the name Kelly in his contacts before. Curiosity got the better of me, and I began scrolling through the messages. Mostly they were business-related, but sometimes they exchanged jokes or discussed something personal. These were small things, but these small details made me wary. When Mark returned to the room, I quickly put the phone back and tried to act as usual. But inside me, a storm of doubts began. Should I bring up this issue? Maybe it's all in my head? Or was I starting to look for problems where there were none? The evening passed in silence. We watched a movie, but I barely paid attention to the screen, lost in my thoughts. When Mark went to bed, I was still sitting on the couch, contemplating what to do next. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but my intuition rarely let me down. At night, I tossed and turned in bed, trying to find an answer. Was it just friendly communication, or was there something more behind it? The next morning, I decided that I could no longer stay silent. These doubts were gnawing at me from the inside, and I realized that the only way to uncover the truth was to talk to Mark. I wanted to believe that everything was innocent, but a part of me couldn't simply ignore what was happening. After breakfast, I approached Mark, who was getting ready for work. He had already put on his jacket and was at the doorstep when I quietly said, "Mark, we need to talk." He turned to me, noticing the seriousness on my face, and nodded. He took off his jacket and sat down on the couch across from me, clearly expecting something important. "Did something happen?" he asked, a hint of apprehension in his voice. I took a deep breath gathering my thoughts. Yesterday, I saw your messages with Kelly, I said, looking him directly in the eyes. I didn't intend to check your phone, but the message popped up on the screen and I just couldn't help but read it. Mark froze. His face became unreadable for a moment, but then he sighed and lowered his head, as if something inside him had broken. Leslie, he began, but I interrupted him. I just want to know the truth, Mark. What's between you two? Is it just work or something more? My words sounded firm, but inside I was terrified to hear what I feared. He remained silent for a long time, as if summoning the courage to speak, and then finally said, I knew this conversation would happen someday, he said softly, looking at the floor. There was nothing physical between Kelly and me. We were just communicating. I've been feeling lonely these past few months. You and I started drifting apart, and I didn't know how to get back to what we had. With Kelly, it all began with regular work-related conversations. But then I started sharing things with her that I couldn't tell you. I just felt that she understood me. I sat silently, trying to process what I had heard. He hadn't cheated on me in a physical sense, but the emotional closeness with another woman was equally painful. Why couldn't you talk to me about this? I whispered, trying not to cry. I didn't know how, Les, he replied. I was afraid that you wouldn't understand, that you would react the way you are now. I didn't want to lose you, but at the same time, I couldn't keep silent any longer. I looked at him, and there was so much sincerity and pain in his eyes that I didn't know how to react. On one hand, I was shocked by his confession, but on the other hand, I felt relieved that he hadn't physically deceived me. We sat for a long time without saying a word. Then I broke the silence. Mark, I felt that distance too. I began quietly. I was also looking for something outside our relationship without even realizing why. But now I understand that the reason was within us. We stopped being open with each other. He nodded in agreement. I don't want to lose you, Leslie. I want us to try to regain what we had. But for that to happen, we both need to change, he said, taking my hand. I don't want to lose us either, I replied. But we're going to have to work hard, Mark. This isn't something we can fix in a single day. I'm willing to try if you are, he said, looking at me with hope in his eyes. We embraced, and in that moment, I felt that it was the most crucial step toward our new beginning. After our honest conversation, something changed with Mark. We both realized how important it is to be truthful with each other, even when the truth is painful. The sense of relief that came with this talk gave us a new chance. That evening, Mark suggested returning to where we had been happy. How about going back to that cottage by the lake? He proposed as we sat in the kitchen. We should remind ourselves of what once connected us. I was surprised, but his suggestion felt right. It was the same cottage where I first felt that our lives could change, but now we had the opportunity to reset everything from scratch. That's a good idea, I replied, smiling. I think that's exactly what we need. We decided to leave the children with their grandmother for the weekend to spend time alone. On Saturday morning, we arrived again at the same cottage by the lakeshore. The sun sparkled on the water, just like before. This place suddenly reminded me of those moments when everything was simpler and easier, when we simply enjoyed each other's presence. Do you remember the last time we went boating? Mark asked with a smile as we stepped onto the shore. Of course I remember, I replied. It was one of those days when everything seemed perfect. We can do that again. Mark looked at me with the sincerity I hadn't seen in a long time. But this time, I want everything to be real, without masks, without unspoken things. We got back into the boat, and as we rowed across the lake, I felt a wave of memories wash over us. We talked about how we met, how we built our life together, about our dreams and hopes. In that moment, I realized that our past hadn't disappeared. It was still with us, like a foundation on which we could build a new future. Later that evening, sitting by the campfire, I looked at Mark and realized that all the doubts and worries that had been tormenting me for the past few months were beginning to dissolve. He was here, next to me, ready to change and work on our relationship. and I was ready to do the same. I thought everything was already lost, I said softly, staring into the fire. But now I understand that we can start all over again. We can, Mark nodded. And I will do everything to ensure that this second chance is the last one we'll need.